I did want to say, um, when I've seen the other more distinguished than me speakers that you've had, many authors, scholars that have influenced me that I admire a great deal. Eric Rutko and Bathsheba DeMuth, just really wonderful authors, thoughtful thinkers. Doug Tallamy is the reason why my wife has planted many oaks and other trees in our yards at home, and growing all sorts of local wildlife. So it's just really wonderful to see you bringing together other people, other thinkers, to share their work and to help grow your own community. So it's a real honor to be a part of that. So taking a step back, I thought I would start with a little bit of background on this project that became my first book. And I'll get into some of the basic arguments of it and why I think that history that I worked on that covers a time period from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century is still pretty relevant today. And it actually goes back to Washington, D.C., where I am once again now. And back almost 25 years ago when I was in college, I spent a summer on an internship sponsored by my university that connected undergraduates with public service, public policy opportunities in Washington, D.C. And so we all kind of explored. We came here over the spring break of our junior year. Some people ended up working for congressional committees. Others ended up working for federal agencies. And I wound up at a think tank at the Rand Corporation. And the connection there, Rand had developed after World War II to really focus on military strategy, Cold War kind of stuff. But in the 70s, they branched out into all sorts of other areas of policymaking. And their primary client is the various agencies of the federal government. And they do research when tasked and paid to do that by different agencies. So I got put on their energy and environment desk. It was a set of offices, a bunch of scholars who worked on public policy as it related to energy and the environment. And I had just turned 21. So I was still kind of trying to figure out what I was going to do with my intellectual, academic, professional life at this time. And the project that we were working on was looking at the future. Something I'd never really done in any kind of systematic way before. And the idea was to look at, the project was tasked by a branch of the US Department of Energy that focused on energy efficiency and renewable energy. There are different offices at the Energy Department. Some focus on fossil fuels and some focus on research. And this office focused on renewable energies and energy efficiency. And the question that they tasked the think tank with was, we know that there are lots of different organizations, the federal government, international organizations, businesses, academics, who make predictions of what energy consumption and energy production might look like in the future. And we want you to synthesize all of them, as many as you can, together, put them all together, and help give us a picture, a map of what the world could look like in 20, 30, 50 years hence when it comes to energy production and consumption. And that will allow us to then go to lawmakers in Congress, to go to others in the government and say, well, if you want the world to look like this, these are the policy steps you would need to get there. If you want the world to look like that, then these are the policy steps you would take to get there or not take to get there. So I spent the summer working on that, squishing together all sorts of predictions. And we wound up with a published article that was very much thinking about global warming at the time. This was around the year 2000, and fears of the imminent shortages of oil, to kind of explore what were the kinds of steps, how dramatic they would have to be to reduce energy consumption to various levels without, hopefully, causing any kind of economic damage. We could show that, for example, if the global economy collapsed catastrophically, that would probably reduce a lot of energy consumption, but that really wasn't the goal. We didn't want to get to that future. We wanted to keep economies working well and people comfortable while also reducing energy consumption. Anyway, that's what I worked on. And the reason why I tell you that story is one day I was taking the metro in DC to work, and I saw a very big poster on the wall advertising why you should take the metro, which seems strange to me because I was clearly taking the metro. I would only see this advertisement if I was already taking it. I was already sold. I'm taking the metro. But the ad was basically saying, you should take the metro, take public transportation, because the metro, unlike your automobile commuting to work, doesn't create pollution. Well, I think if I'd seen that poster the year before, I would have thought nothing of. Actually, I probably would have thought very self-congratulatory thoughts about my lack of environmental impact. I would have felt very good about myself. But I'd spent the whole summer studying energy and learning about where energy actually comes from and where it goes. And this was a time where this wasn't as perhaps widely understood as it might be today. And so I knew at that point, Washington, D.C. was getting, I don't know, maybe 50% or more of its electricity from the burning of fossil fuel, particularly coal, burning of coal to create the electricity that powered the metro. So it just seemed there was a kind of cognitive dissonance there for me that, well, I actually am polluting. The metro is polluting because we don't pay attention at so many steps removed from the ultimate sources of where our energy often comes from. So that really got me thinking. I wanted to study energy more. I wanted to keep learning about it, this kind of hidden infrastructure that was so much a part of our lives. So the following year, when I went to graduate school to study the history of science and technology, I wanted to focus on energy. That was what I was really interested in. And this was a moment when the history of energy wasn't a particularly known topic. It wasn't something historians really worked on very much, very sporadically. There were bursts of it that usually reflects current events, right? In the 1970s, there was a big burst with the energy crises of the 70s, a big burst of scholarship, including historical scholarship on energy, and then it kind of faded away. It happened again, maybe in the late 80s and faded away again. Well, I went to graduate school. A few weeks later, 9/11 happens, which segued very quickly into a war in Iraq, which seemed to have something to do with oil, although it was very hard to kind of pin down exactly what. Iraq had a lot of oil. That seemed to be something curious about the US intervention there. And so these questions were now very much public, and I was already committed in graduate school to studying the history of energy in some way. And at that point, what I was learning was the literatures that focused on the kind of strategy, geopolitics of energy, particularly the geopolitics of oil, was over here. It was in one bucket. And the scholarship, the historical scholarship and other scholarship that focused on environmental impacts was over here in a different bucket, which struck me as odd. I was accumulating shelves and shelves of books that dealt with geopolitics of energy and environmental impacts, environmental histories of energy, and they didn't seem to be talking to each other at all. So I thought that would be some contribution to start to bring those two literatures together and try to understand the environmental and geopolitical stories as really part of the same story and see how they were in some way connected. So I thought the obvious place to start was what I understood to be the beginning. I like to start at beginnings. I'm a historian who likes to understand where things came from. So I went back to the early 20th century, which was when oil first became a major motive fuel and got connected with national security. Now, some of you might know that oil, of course, had been a significant commodity from the middle of the 19th century through the later part of the 19th century, but it was mainly as an illuminant, right? It was for the kerosene in the oil to burn in lamps, to bring illumination to places that were dark before there was electrification. And oil as a fuel source really didn't pick up until the early 20th century. As gasoline for motor cars, but also as fuel oil for ships and as a fuel for other kinds of vehicles that became really prominent during World War I, tanks and trucks and things like that. And there was a good record of the debates that Americans then had about both the advantages and the disadvantages to adopting oil as a fuel. It was easier to transport, for sure. Easier than coal, which had to be carried in very clunky railroad cars. And the United States appeared to have a fair amount of oil, but there were serious concerns about future supplies, even in the 1920s, not to mention the ecological consequences of its consumption. Even then, it was clear that oil was causing what we would now consider to be environmental damage. But a funny thing happened to me, actually, while I was in DC, working in archives here and studying the people who were writing letters and reports and memos that I was reading to understand the strategic significance of oil in the 20th century. And what I found was they were mainly talking about coal, not oil at all, which was odd to me because I hadn't ever read anything about the geopolitics of coal in the early 20th century or the 19th century. That it was an oil story. The literatures that focused on oil and as preludes to the geopolitics, they went back and looked at oil as an illuminant. The stories were about the commodities, not about energy in general and how it relates to questions of strategy and geopolitics. So slowly I found myself being drawn backwards in time, further back, at first just wanting to understand the geopolitics of coal as a prelude to the history that I really wanted to write. And then eventually I found myself engulfed by coal altogether. There was enough of a story there that it was worth telling on its own. So the next several years found me finishing my dissertation and continuing to research and revise this material into the book. And now I think I can go over some of the central arguments and the conclusions, and then wrap up with some thoughts about why I think this is still worth studying. I'm going to share my screen so you can see a bit of a slideshow. If I can pull that up here. Okay, can you see that? Sharing okay? Yeah. It's good. Okay, wonderful. All right. Right. So the basic arc of my history looks at the century between 1840 and 1940. And it essentially asks, how did Americans come to think about energy in terms of national security at all? Now, the question, even to me sometimes, seems like completely obvious. Well, it was obviously important, right? It was connected to things that mattered to militaries, to navies, to national economies. Clearly, it must have been obvious to people at the time that coal was a strategic commodity. But it turns out to be a much more complicated story. There was a long process over decades, even a century, as Americans learned different ways they could strategize around coal and bring it into the kind of national debate of how to shape politics and policy. Other countries were doing this as well, particularly Great Britain. So the book is really about how this all happened. And I open the book with an anecdote about Franklin Roosevelt's historic meeting with the then King of Saudi Arabia, Abdulaziz ibn Saud, in 1945. It was on Valentine's Day in 1945. And this was a meeting that is often looked back upon as an important marker of the origins of the deep US-Saudi relationship. And this was a relationship that was marked very significantly by the roles of producers and consumers of oil. Now, Americans had certainly gone abroad searching for oil before 1945. And frankly, at this moment, what turned out to be toward the end of World War II, Saudi reserves weren't yet much more than speculative. There was some good evidence to think there was a good deal of oil there, but it wasn't something that was terribly certain and certainly was not producing yet. But this meeting and the relationship that it helped foster had long been seen as an important turning point after which the US slowly began to depend on other countries, often volatile countries, for its much needed oil. And as the US emerged after World War II as the world's dominant power, its leaders thought a whole lot about the strategic necessity of oil, which they experienced during World War II itself, which they saw as an indispensable part of the prosperous economy emerging after the war, and in the context of the Cold War, which they assumed would be even more essential to preserve oil for a future war that might break out. But then I bring the reader back a century to 1845, when Americans aboard the USS Constitution I'll get to that in just a sec, which was a frigate that had first been built in the 1790s, one of the original 6 sail-powered frigates built during the Washington administration. And the Constitution in 1845 was sent on a secret mission around the world. And the most important part of the secret instructions were to scope out coal supplies on the island of Borneo. And while they were there, the officers of the ship tried to negotiate a special treaty with the Sultan of Brunei for access to nearby coal mines, which were thought at this time to be significant. And then they then stopped by the nearby tiny island off the coast called Labuan to explore for the coal themselves. Now, there are some superficial similarities between these 2 missions, right? An American representative going abroad, in large part to forge an alliance around access to a fossil fuel, but there are also important differences, and I'll talk more about those in just a moment. But my book is, in essence, about the path between those 2 voyages, right? And how Americans came to look at the security dimensions of energy in very different ways over this period. So, and this is the image of Labuan. It's a small island off the coast of Brunei, which is part of the larger island of Borneo. This was taken from the works of the British official who became effectively the Raja of this territory, and basically kept the Americans from getting access to the coal because he wanted to keep it for British use. So onto the main arguments, right? So first, next here, first argument of the book. The story of how Americans began to think about energy in terms of national security begins with coal, not oil, right? Basic point. Historians who've looked at the origins of American foreign energy policy have typically looked exactly where I had started my project, at oil in the early 20th century. But we have to go back farther and see how the American experience with coal set up the later American experience with oil. And this argument really has 2 parts. First, that as Americans began to use coal to generate steam power to travel around the world, and I'm talking here about back in the 1840s or so, they encountered new problems that had to be addressed by Congress, by presidents, by the Navy, by engineers and scientists, and others as well. And the second part is that gradually, eventually, these responses to the problems created by the introduction of steam power were formulated in terms of national security. So how does this happen? Well, I start not with naval strategy or national defense or kind of military issues, military concerns, but with the post office. Now, today, the post office, the U.S. Postal Service, as it's known, is basically a business run as a semi-independent agency of the federal government, but subject to some very strict limitations on what it can do, what it can spend, how it must do its job. But back in the 19th century, the post office was basically the IT branch of the nation, right? It was the information technology branch of the federal government. There's a reason that running a post office was codified in the Constitution. American political thinkers of the late 18th and early 19th centuries were very worried that there had never been a republic in history as large as these new United States. And they believed that without really good flows of information, newspapers, business letters, reports from the central government, representative democracy would fall apart. The people had to know what their representatives were doing in Washington in their names. And those representatives had to stay in touch with their constituents back home to know what they wanted. And this was at a time when land travel was exceedingly slow, and it could take weeks or longer to move from one place to another. Now, Americans were just as interested in flows of information overseas. At first, American lawmakers in the 1790s anticipated following the British imperial example of providing for a government-run international postal service, that is, government-owned or subsidized ships to carry the mail along more or less fixed routes. This is in the 1790s. But the idea kind of fell apart pretty quickly, and American correspondence overseas was taken up by private merchant vessels. You can see this origins of this tension between things that the government wanted to do or things that the founders, in fact, anticipated happening for the benefit of everybody with some national direction and national funding, and then falling back on, we'll let people do this for profit and hope that it all works out. So between the late 18 teens and the 1830s, American packet boats, they're called packet boats because they carried packets of mail, like packages of mail and newspapers, they became the dominant form of transatlantic communication. And the image that I have up on the slideshow now is one of the ships from the so-called Blackball line, because it's got a big black circle painted on one of its foresails. And this was one of the prominent packet boats that carried the mail across the Atlantic, to and from across the Atlantic. But then engineers developed steam engines. The steam engines were powered by coal, and they could send a ship across the ocean really quickly. Now, the British government began subsidizing lines of these vessels in the late 1830s under the theory that they increased British commerce. They provided auxiliary vessels for the Royal Navy, right? In an emergency, they could be basically taken over by the Navy and used for official purposes. And basically, they helped knit the growing British Empire together. Now, this whole prospect absolutely terrified Americans, who began to see their dominance of transatlantic communications slip away. Now, an important note, the problem here wasn't just that Americans didn't want to lose a kind of business carrying the mail. They had previously dominated. They saw control over flows of information as critical to American success in the world, right? This information wasn't just personal letters at a time when immigration to the United States was rapidly increasing and personal letters were very valuable, but it was business correspondence. It was diplomatic instructions. It was newspapers, right? If they became subject to the constraints of British letter carrying, American businesses might find that their letters got delivered more slowly than British ones, causing them to miss out on important investment opportunities. American diplomats remained disadvantaged in the timely delivery of critical instructions from home. And without the ability to inexpensively send newspapers, the American perspective on the world was shut out from readers in England or continental Europe. So in the mid-1840s, Congress began subsidizing lines of mail steamers of its own. Here's an image of one of those. And I don't have time to get into the details of these lines right now, which I'm happy to do in the Q&A, but the important point is the attempt to build transatlantic steamers showed that one of the central difficulties in setting up this new global infrastructure was securing the needed coal. It turned out that different kinds of coal mined in different kinds of places burned differently in different kinds of steam engines. And supplies of the best kinds for steaming were not immediately available in the places Americans wanted to steam to. Ports without nearby mines required very expensive coal shipped sometimes from other continents. And this series of problems pushed the question ultimately to Congress, which began looking for ways to build ships that could burn less coal for the same effect, or replace it altogether with some different source of power. In the book, I talk about the difference between economy and efficiency. Americans were very concerned with this idea of economy, of making the best use of the resources available, not wasting. This became kind of a dominant way of thinking in the middle of the 19th century. So during this period, Americans seeking to build these steamships approached economizing in very different ways. One involved studying the coal itself, right? As economy of fuel began with adequate supplies. There were chemists, there were geologists, and they worked hard to identify what were the kinds of coal that would meet the demands of steamship engines over other kinds. There were engineers, and the engineers understood that different industrial processes called for different kinds of coal, the precise chemical compositions of which favored different kinds of uses. Weighing these compositions against price and availability, steam engine operators selected bituminous coal or anthracite coal. Sometimes actually they chose hardwood or pine. This is a quote from that I cite from someone at the time. Each of these has its peculiar manner of burning. It's from a popular engineering manual. And hence the furnaces or fireplaces in which they are used must differ in form and arrangement. Now, this peculiarity meant that between the 1820s and the 1850s, research into steaming fuels required careful attention to very specific varieties of fuel from specific places. Unlike wheat or beef, which were important commodities also, high-precision fuel woods and coals could not be easily commodified across different states or fields or strata, right? It was one thing to take wheat, and historians have studied this, wheat grown from all sorts of different places, grind it into flour, grade the flour in certain categories, and mix all of those equivalent categories, flour from the same categories together, and sell it as something common, regardless of where it originally came from. You couldn't do that with coal because it really depended what kind of mine, what kind of geological circumstances produced a particular coal. The geographic and kind of, in a sense, ecological, environmental connection remained really important for coal in ways it didn't for other things. Wood from apple trees or American chestnuts or Jersey pines, they all burned in particular ways that rooted them to particular geographies, just like coal from the Lehigh Valley would forever burn differently from specimens mined along the Schuylkill or in Newcastle. Coal that was used for copper smelting couldn't contain large quantities of sulfur or iron. Cannel coal was really good for steam engines, but you couldn't use it for iron making, and on and on and on. And I have a image here. Oh, this is one of the other steamers. Right. So this is an illustration of one of the many experiments on burning different kinds of coal to figure out what would work best in these particular kinds of steam engines. And among many examples, I could talk about this for a long, long time. The exemplary figure who worked to discover the specific properties of steaming coals was a man named Walter Johnson, who was a scientist who wanted to apply the insights of science not merely for public betterment, but betterment through the action of the state by the government. And between the Navy and commercial steamers, as well as growing industrial and commercial interests, Johnson believed that coal was a problem for the federal government. The government of the United States, he wrote, though not possessing this direct interest in proprietorship in mines, right, didn't own the mines, didn't run the mines, had still such a stake in the value of their resources and the prosperity of citizens more immediately concerned in making them available, that the least which could reasonably be expected of it is to aid in some measure in ascertaining their true value. So to this end, Johnson's research program followed the kind of public-private partnership that really characterized a great deal of governance in mid-19th century America. In the early 1840s, for example, the Navy had issued a call to American coal mine owners and coal dealers to supply Johnson with samples for comparative analysis, a prospect that didn't only aid the Navy in evaluating different fuels, but also promised to help coal companies themselves learn what purposes their products were ideally suited for. So this traveled all around the country and resulted in an enormous study of these coals and their domestic and international values. Here, I really love this illustration of these fish. The engineering of steamships mattered also. In the 1840s and 50s, engineers and entrepreneurs and investors and inventors flooded Congress with ideas for new devices that improved fuel economy. These illustrations are by a man named Thomas Eubank, who was then the commissioner of patents in the government, federal government, and he found inspiration for this work at a New York fish market. He was delayed there while traveling, and he began drawing these natural propellers arrayed before him. These are the fins of these fish, the tails, the porgy and salmon and cod and mackerel and flounder. And he later expanded this to other kinds of animals, mammals, birds that propelled themselves in water. And according to him, according to Eubank, nature held lessons for contemporary engineers. Redesigning paddle wheels of steamboats, according to the lessons of nature, could shave 12 to 24 hours from a transatlantic voyage without any increase in power, which is to say you didn't have to have as much coal to travel across the ocean. And like many similar appeals for funding, Eubanks was rejected by the Senate's Committee on Naval Affairs, but not before William Seward, then a senator from New York before becoming Secretary of State in the 1860s, declared that people of the future will look back upon the inefficient paddle wheels of his present day and wonder at their gross unmechanical action. So that wasn't an appropriation, but members of Congress were now regularly exposed to arguments for the importance of economizing for public benefit. Other engineering research looked for ways to economize on fuel, from screw propellers to replace paddle wheels, condensers to remove salt from water to be boiled in steam engines. They had plans for engines that didn't rely on steam at all, but really wacky ideas with electromagnetism or pressurized air. And Americans looked abroad. They looked abroad for places where they might be able to find coal where they traveled, instead of having to bring it along with them. Here is an example from the voyage of Matthew Perry, Commodore Matthew Perry, to Japan in the early 1850s, which actually included, this was famous, infamous, for bringing a bunch of gunships, gunboats into Edo Bay, which is now Tokyo Bay, and forcing the opening of Japan, so-called forcing the opening of Japan to American commerce and trade, after the country had been much more isolated from not entirely, but much more isolated from international affairs and commerce for the 200 or so preceding years. Well, as it turns out, Perry wasn't there because Japan itself was the goal. Japan was simply in the way of the steamer route to China. And Americans wanted to get to China. And when they learned that there might be coal in or around Japan, that became one of the main reasons that Americans looked to so-called, again, open the country there. And as part of this expedition, the crews under Perry's command actually searched for coal mines themselves in the nearby islands of Formosa, the Luchu Islands, and elsewhere, to support this new growing infrastructure for Americans. So basically, by the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, coal was a significant issue and would become even more so during the war itself. Now, the second argument that I talk about in the book is about the history of technology and about American industrialization in particular, and that it was intimately tied up with the history of American foreign relations. These aren't separate stories, right? Industrialization, history of American foreign relations, not separate stories, but deeply intertwined ones. We can't tell one without the other. And specifically here, the arguments and actions of American politicians and naval officers and business leaders drew consciously upon the innovations of fossil-fueled steam power in articulating the roles for the US in the world. Americans debated their role in the world with the knowledge of what steam made possible, or what they wished and believed it made possible, right? The design of engines, the selection of fuels, the organization of lines of supply, the entire infrastructure of the global fossil fuel network all help shape the structure of the broader vision of the US in the world. And at the same time, mechanical and bureaucratic changes reflected pressures from outside of American borders as Americans pursued new approaches to energy in response to perceived threats to their security. So one example of this that I could talk about is from a place called Chiriquí. This is an area of what's now modern-day Panama on the border of Costa Rica. And in the middle of the 19th century, Panama was still a province of Colombia. Actually, there are various names that the Greater Confederation had at various times, but effectively it was controlled as a province of Colombia, and had been since independence from Spain earlier in the 19th century. And the people, the relatively small population of non-indigenous peoples who lived in Panama, they often resented the distant control of Bogota, and sought potential independence. And then there was this discovery of coal in Chiriquí in the 1850s. And this became very important because it was precisely at this time that Americans were very, very interested in finding a shortcut to get to the Pacific Ocean, right? If you think about the gold rush in 1849, which caused an absolute deluge of Americans traveling from kind of the urban centers of the East Coast to California. They were very rarely going overland. There was very little way. I mean, a few people did it, but it was a tiny minority of people could get. There was no railroad that connected the continent yet. And of course, this was territory that only had recently become incorporated into the U.S. after it was taken from Mexico by force after the Mexican War in the later 1840s. And so because so much transportation was based on water, it seemed like if you could get Americans by boat to the narrowest place you could traverse, like Panama, the Isthmus of Panama, that might be the best way to get to California, to get to the gold fields, to get to eventually trade with the Far East. Well, if there was coal nearby, so much the better. So an American entrepreneur went to Chiriquí. He liked what he found. He started entreaties to the government in Bogota, which ultimately granted him a concession. And he brought that to Washington and said, look, I've got control of this massive coal field in Panama, and I will lease it to you to help commerce and trade in the Navy be able to develop its infrastructure in and around the Caribbean and the Pacific. And this was now the kind of later part of the 1850s. It resulted in several expeditions of the government to kind of explore, was this coal any good? They sent it to chemists. They said, actually, this is really lousy coal. You don't want this coal at all. There was a lot of subterfuge, a lot of lying going on and lobbying. Some members of Congress were probably pretty clearly paid off by this guy to try to get them to pass legislation in his favor. And it seemed like things were not going so well when there was an election in 1860, and a politician from a new party, the Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln, won, of course. States started seceding in the South, national crisis, and now there's a war. And so this entrepreneur goes to Washington again. And he says, well, look, this could help the war effort. This could be really valuable in supporting all those steamers you have blockading the southern coast, preventing them from shipping their cotton to England, which was a major part of the national strategy. And so Lincoln gets very interested in this, particularly in the possibility of colonization. Now, Lincoln had been an old Whig. He'd kind of grown up as a Whig, and Whigs were, in a sense, they were progressive but moderate. And one of the ideas that they had shared over many decades was colonization. And it was premised on the idea that slavery was bad. Slavery was not a good thing for the United States. It was dehumanizing to the enslaved. It was dehumanizing to those doing the slaving. But they also had a very kind of fixed racial view of the world and didn't believe that people of different races could really coexist in a republic together. So the idea of colonization was the end of slavery will come from emancipating slaves and then taking them somewhere else, right? Resettling them somewhere else. It could be back to Africa. This is where the project for Liberia comes from in the early 19th century. That turned out to be really hard. Turns out most emancipated slaves did not want to go to Liberia, a place they'd never seen, did not have even any ancestral ties to, and it was very expensive to pay for these kinds of journeys. There were health risks, on and on and on. So what about something closer? What about maybe Haiti? What about Chiriquí? And so Lincoln hit upon this idea of resettling emancipated slaves in Panama, in Chiriquí, to mine coal for the Navy. And this project advanced along in across 1861 and 1862, even as Lincoln is beginning to draft the Emancipation Proclamation and make his plans for emancipating the slaves of the states that had been in territories that had been conquered militarily. And ultimately, once he does issue the final Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st of 1863, this project begins to kind of fade out. But it gets picked up again and again over the coming decades of politicians, of the investors, really trying to make this a new kind of a new project, a new colony for for kind of racial purposes and strategic purposes. So that was one example. So argument, the third argument I want to talk about here is something that is something I used to encounter all the time when I read histories of American foreign relations. When you get into the later part of the 19th century, there's this weird period where Americans start taking over a whole bunch of islands around the world. Hawaii, of course, the Philippines, really tremendous, large archipelago, Guam, Samoa, Puerto Rico, Guantanamo Bay in the tip of Cuba. These all happen within a very short period of years of each other. And historians have puzzled over explaining why this happened for a very long time. And one of the explanations that will show up in any textbook and any kind of broad synthetic history of this period is Americans pursued coaling stations, right? They had this infrastructure, they had a navy, they had commerce, and just like the British were building coaling stations, like giant gas stations for their ships, Americans were doing that as well. It was kind of a great competition of these Western powers, and that explains, at least in part, why Americans wanted to seize these islands. Well, I found in my research, and I think in some senses this is one of the most unexpected and I think original arguments that I make in the book, is that gets it completely backwards. Americans were not seeking coaling stations in the 1890s. They wound up with island territory that then they had to defend and thus build coaling stations on the islands to defend them because they were very vulnerable and exposed to other potential imperial powers. The imperialism came first, the coaling stations came later. Here's a coaling station at Cristobal. This is actually in Panama. I think it was the largest in the world at the time, and you can kind of get a sense of this. This is the infrastructure. This is the energy infrastructure of the turn of the 20th century. Massive depot for supplying naval vessels and commercial vessels to keep the sinews of commerce flowing and protect the key strategic interests of the United States. This is an illustration, Pago Pago, Samoa, and it's one of the arguments, one of the stories that I make in this section of the book, looking at how the American, on paper, there was an attempt to put a coaling station on Pago Pago in Samoa in the beginning of the 1880s. But if you actually look at what happened, it was nothing. It was insignificant. It was forgotten from the moment it was set up. Years went by. There was no coal. The coal that was there got rotten. It couldn't be used. There was actually no commercial route that American ships were conceivably traveling on that would require them to stop in Samoa as a refueling station. And I kind of mount this evidence for this argument to show that, in fact, it was most importantly annexing the Philippines after the Spanish-American Cuban-Filipino War of 1898 that American policymakers and naval strategists realized they now had this massive territory that was very vulnerable to British or German or Russian or Chinese or Japanese aggression. And so that was the justification for building coaling stations at places like Hawaii, which had just also been annexed, or elsewhere in the Pacific. Here, this is a photograph I really love. I found this actually in Michigan, advertising Pocahontas coal. By the turn of the 20th century, this was, I talked before about the geological specificity of kinds of coal. This is coal found in a region right on the border of Virginia and West Virginia that was considered really ideal for steaming purposes because it was so-called smokeless coal. It was not anthracite, it was semi-bituminous, which is kind of between bituminous coal and anthracite coal in its hardness, but it burned very cleanly. It had kind of a light white smoke, so it was harder to, you can actually see the smoke from some of these tug vessels that are very dark smoke. That makes it very easy to identify an enemy vessel many miles away. So Pocahontas was a very dense, energy-rich fuel that didn't have that kind of problem. But this was the strategic kinds of issues that Americans were thinking about at the time. And one of the ways they ended up addressing this before they got to coaling stations, which I argue was the outcome, not the cause, was using, again, science to travel better. This is from Science magazine, the journal. And there was a whole series of efforts by mathematicians and navigators in the latter part of the 19th century, many of them Americans, to find better ways to calculate how to travel straight lines on the globe. This was really actually a fun part of the project. If you take a globe, I'm at my aunt and uncle's house. I don't have a globe. I have globes at home. If you take a globe and you stick a pin in one place, and say a pin in San Francisco, and then another pin in Tokyo, and you draw a rubber band between them, that straight line there doesn't show up as a straight line on the Mercator map, the map that we're most familiar with. It shows up as a weird curve because the Earth is spherical, right? So the straight line between 2 points on the globe is called a great circle. And this is one of many kinds of representations of what great circles look like when you stretch them out and make them flat. And you can see if you're going from, here is San Francisco kind of at the bottom middle part of the screen, all the way up to Yokohama, Japan, northern part of Japan up in the top left, that straight line doesn't go across the middle of the Pacific, as you might think, but it actually kind of skirts along the Aleutian Islands of Alaska and the Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia. It's a very northern route. That straightest route is a very northern route. And so if there could be ways that navigators could figure out to make the mathematics of how to calculate those routes easier, this would be very valuable, because then ships could travel the shorter routes instead of long out-of-the-way ones that could add days or weeks to voyages, because the navigators found going on the Mercator map routes, which are circuitous, it's easier to calculate them. You make one calculation and you go. You have to keep recalculating when you're doing a great circle route, and that was very complicated. So this is just an example of a particular kind of projector that was used. It was one of the methods of making great circle calculations easier for ship captains and navigators. This takes us to the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. I don't know if anybody's ever been there. It's a pretty interesting place. I did a lot of research there for this project. And the folks who worked there, including the great naval theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan, historian and theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was very influential in shaping both American, also German thinking about naval strategy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, has often been cited by historians as he was talking about the importance of coaling stations. Well, he does, but he says in the 1890s when he's writing about them, yeah, but the US isn't going to build them. The British will build them. The US has to think of other ways to advance its interests, and the US isn't going to be building empires around the world. He didn't see that as likely. He instead was advocating things like building battleships that could patrol close to the shores of the United States, and cruisers that were going to travel around the world to protect American commerce and kind of show the flag around the world, that had to be very efficient, very technically efficient, very fuel efficient, because they couldn't count on having American coaling stations like the British had in their empire around the world. It was not until after 1898, after the Spanish-American War, after the US acquires the Philippines and Guam and Puerto Rico and Guantanamo Bay and the Hawaii, that Americans really started focusing on coaling stations. It also took Americans to Alaska. I actually went up here when I was in graduate school to see the remnants of this project and look at some records that were still there. This was in Chickaloon, Alaska, in the Matanuska Valley, and was a project in the 19-teens into early 1920s to mine coal in Alaska right near those great circle routes. Right? Wouldn't it be better if Americans were going to travel across the Pacific by this northern route if they could just stop off in Alaska to refuel, much better than out of the way Hawaii. And this project went on for a couple of years before eventually shutting down for reasons I could talk about later. So this kind of takes me to why I think this story is still relevant as I kind of wrap up here. This, of course, is Richard Nixon. And in 1973, this is in the early months of the energy crisis, the first energy crisis, as we call it, oil crisis. This is a quote from a speech he gave where Nixon spoke about setting as our national goal, in the spirit of the Apollo moon landings and with the determination of the Manhattan Project, that by the end of this decade, we will have developed the potential to meet our own energy needs without depending on any foreign energy sources. And he called this Project Independence. And it was, a rhetorical way to talk about what America could do to protect itself against what was happening with the OPEC oil embargo in 1973 and 1974. Come up with a way to have energy independence. And this caught on. We still talk about energy independence today. It's a very potent political phrase. It often comes up when oil prices go high. And one of the things that I concluded myself in doing this work on this book was energy independence is illusory, right? Saudi Arabia is a giant exporter of oil. It's plenty energy independent of its oil, and yet is completely tied up with the geopolitics of energy because it produces oil and is dependent on global markets that set prices. And is very worried, of course, if other countries are going to move away from fossil fuels because of concerns about global warming, because that affects their stability, their economy. Countries don't become independent of the global energy system. And that dependence, that interconnectedness, goes back to the 19th century. And it goes back to coal. It goes back to people around the world connecting during this era of great globalization that was economic, it was cultural, it was demographic, people moving, it was political, it involved warfare. But all of those interconnections with industrialization were premised on energy. At the time, that meant pretty exclusively coal. And what I argue now is that should there be a future without oil, should there be a future without fossil fuels even, other alternative energy sources providing all of our needs, that's not going to make us independent, right? We're still going to be connected with other countries, whether it's for the materials to go into making the solar panels, or it's because a country is going to buy electricity generated by solar panels in a neighboring country, or any other number of reasons. Because countries are connected, their energy systems are going to remain connected. Here's another quote that I like to talk about from Thomas Friedman, the New York Times columnist. Again, talking about energy independence during the Bush era, as if only the U.S. did not have to buy oil from other countries, that would be the key lever to force, global change, right? Funding for terrorism. It will compel adversarial countries, Iran or Russia or Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, to reform because they can't be dependent on the money, the riches they got from selling oil. That this would kind of cause all these changes. And I say, no. This is completely the wrong way of thinking about it. Everybody is connected. Energy systems are connected. They were connected before oil. They're going to be connected after oil. And it is a big mistake to think that simply changing one source of energy to another is going to somehow solve all the many problems that we have in the world. And of course, in terms of problems, the biggest, certainly on my agenda, is global warming, which is completely tied up with the consumption of fossil fuels. We've certainly seen in recent years the conflict in Ukraine, Russia and Ukraine, how concern about the environmental impact of energy runs up against the strategic kinds of questions, which brings me back full circle to the questions I began my book project with, about trying to see how these were in fact connected. And I would actually just throw out there that one of the rhetorically powerful ways, politically powerful ways to get support for moving to alternative non-fossil fuel energies is to argue for the strategic advantages of them, even if those are not going to be panacea and solve all the problems in the world. So that's it. That's what I wanted to talk about. I hope that was interesting. I'm happy to take questions, and we'll kind of take it from there. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. That was very interesting. I'm going to put a gallery on. And I want to say again that if you have questions, please put them in chat. There's one question that's posted here already about energy independence. And then we have, which I think you addressed as you were finishing up, and then we have a question from Anne. You mentioned that America in the mid-17th century has an attitude of not being had an attitude of not being wasteful of energy. We seem to have the opposite attitude now. Do you have any insight on how we made that cultural shift?
That's a great question. I think it was intention in the 19th century. I mean, the Americans in the mid-19th century were not as prosperous as Americans. Most Americans are, or a greater percentage of Americans are today. And that shaped how Americans dealt with everything. And economizing was a kind of moral value, not to be extravagant, not to be wasteful. It was very much connected with Calvinist thought, frankly, Protestant thinking, I think in many ways. The shift comes with industrialization, with the rise of industrial capitalism, with the rise of a consumer society, and with the real kind of embrace of the abundance, the seeming abundance of the North American continent, that there's surely enough to go around. There's surely enough resources. It's inexhaustible. And that carries through, much of the late 19th century until we get real concerns about running out. You get a conservation movement that tries to protect resources for future consumption. It was not mainly setting stuff aside to never be touched, but to make sure that, like we would say, sustainable, right? The consumption of forest resources were sustainable. The consumption of fuel resources were at a pace that they could be sufficient for the long-term future. I think this shifts again after World War II with the just tremendous growth of the U.S. economy, its global dominance, economic dominance, political, military, cultural dominance, and a real sense that the capitalist system, the democratic system, the size of the country, and the growth of the economy and the prosperity of most of the people was proof of the rightness of consumption, and that the worries were misplaced. This, of course, becomes a big debate again in the 1970s with the energy crises and environmental rise of the modern environmental movement. But I think the power of linking that to the economy was very strong. We don't see this very much anymore, but certainly 20 years ago, I remember actually very vividly during the Bush administration, one of the arguments against addressing global warming was energy use is linearly tied to the economy, to economic growth. If you cut back on energy, you're going to cut back on the economy. That's going to kill jobs. That's a bad thing. Well, we've decoupled those things now. The economy has continued to grow while energy consumption has been flat or slightly declining. But there was a belief for a long time that they were completely tied up together, and that it was too risky to reduce one without hurting the other. I think we now have a bit of we have space to say that that's not a necessary connection.
All right, that's fantastic. So I have two other questions, and the first one here is, how do you feel like, and again, this is looking at the future, how do you think the adoption of new technologies and any energy generation would enhance or constrain American opportunities in the world, like today, moving forward?
That's a great question. So there's a premise we have as historians of technology. We often say, we talk about something called the technological fix, which is this belief that there's the right technology somewhere that someone will invent that will solve some social problem, political problem. And historians of technology tend to be pretty negative about technological fixes. And we have books and books and books and articles about the misplaced faith in technological fixes. And I would say that I have long thought that our energy problems are social problems, right? They're social and political problems. They're not really technological problems. And I mean, if you could take Cleveland, for example, right? I've lived in Cleveland for 15 years now. There's been for at least that length of time, if not longer, an effort to build a demonstration wind farm in Lake Erie. And it has been fought, tooth and nail by the economic interests that benefit from the current system. It's been tied up in legal battles, political fights. The technology exists. I mean, the technology is not the problem. These kinds of wind turbines are manufactured in Europe, and they're used in Europe already, and they have been for decades. It's a political and social problem. I think, though, now that the technology is part of the story, but I've kind of come around to thinking that in the American context, the American political and social context, it's hard for me to imagine a shift to overwhelmingly sustainable energy sources that doesn't let people make money from them, right? People are invested in the capitalist system, whether you like it or not. And if there are technologies, if there are marketing opportunities for people to profit from it, then I think if that's going to get people to consume less energy and for us to pollute less carbon dioxide, that may be the shortest path to get there. So I think technology plays a role in that sense. Like, how do we get it adopted? Now, there are technological problems that haven't been solved. I mean, to have really efficient long-term batteries for energy storage, for example. I mean, there are plenty of things that we could talk about that are not yet solved technical problems. But that's kind of how my thinking has evolved a little bit over time.
Okay. Oh, that makes sense. I see what you're saying. Two more questions, and then we're going to do our drawing for the book. The first one is, so you talk a lot about how the anthracite in your book, you talk a lot about how anthracite was found in the Appalachian Mountains, and it took a while for people to realize how valuable that kind of coal was and what it was good for, and the different properties of different coals. But in the meantime, all of this mining was happening in communities, and all of these people were being hurt in some way or another by the mining that was happening. So how did the communities respond?
Yeah.
And did their response have any effect on how policy was shaped?
That's a great question. I actually had an intention of having more labor history first in the dissertation and later in the book than I ended up being able to do. There's just no room for that. You have to draw the line somewhere. Coal, there are many coal communities around Appalachia and beyond in the 19th century. And they poisoned people, they polluted, they killed a lot of people. When I lecture about labor and coal in the 19th century in my energy history class, I share with the students survey data from the government about comparative evidence of how many American miners died from various kinds of accidents compared with coal miners in Belgium, in France, in Germany. And the American numbers were just orders of magnitude higher because the safety precautions were not in place. The companies controlled things. They pushed people to extremes, and they didn't invest in safety when they could have. The safety technologies existed, but they didn't use them. So yes, people certainly got hurt from coal. I had wanted to put in the book at one point, this was in 1898, when there was a big debate in the country about should the United States keep these islands that it seized after the war with Spain, should it keep the Philippines? And I was reading through issues of the United Mine Workers weekly newspaper, and it had a really fantastic opinion, like a letter to the editor, that was saying, we stand in solidarity with the workers around the world and the oppressed peoples around the world, but if the U.S. takes the Philippines, there's going to be a lot of demand for coal to get there, and we're going to benefit from that. And you can see how people's self-interest stood in tension with their kind of broader political and moral commitments. So that was a very striking thing that I wished I could have included, but didn't get a chance to. What ends up really happening for the coal miners, this was actually very much a technological and capitalist story. Over the course of the 20th century, between longwall mining, which is a method of mining underground with big machines, and then especially with open pit mining out west, just the labor market for coal miners collapsed, and to the point where today there are very, very few coal miners, people employed in coal mining, even as we still have coal mines. So very few people do it. And that was something that happened over a period of decades, but just the employment of coal miners really, really collapsed.
All right, that's a good insight. And one final question. I promise this is the last one. But so in chapter 3, you talk about this radically changed perception of time and space that people had as a result of the steamships that were like moving faster and communicating faster. So that, and it took a long time, but that kind of, from your description, drove this change in energy generation and the change in the view of energy generation. So what do you think could drive that kind of paradigm shift today? Why, you kind of touched on that, but what do you, like, what do we need? What do we have to do?
I mean, you're asking somebody who just drove from Queens to DC. I mean, as I was driving, I was, because I was on this time pressure, like I don't want to miss my talk, but I don't want to drive too fast because that's not safe. What was this like in the 19th century? I'm a historian of the 19th century, so I think about that, like, oh, I wouldn't have been in a hurry. No one's in a hurry. You can't be in a hurry. You just have to, it takes as many days as it takes to get from Ohio to the District of Columbia. I think, with the kind of rise of computing and the internet in the end of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st century, I think there was a lot of rhetoric around, right, the next wave of industrial revolution. And I think we're seeing it today with AI, right? AI is going to change everything. Nothing's going to be the same. It's going to change how everybody does. Education is going to change. Writing, jobs are going to change. And I mean, I don't think that's wrong, but I think it implies a commensurability with the changes of the 19th century, which are just incommensurable. The changes over the course of the 19th century, communication and transportation, were such a break from all of previous human history that everything since then has been a modification of that, not subsequent fundamental transformations. I think that's just a purely subjective argument, and I'd be totally open to historians making a different argument. But my subjective feeling is, maybe I'm biased because I studied the 19th century. The change, I don't know if anybody's ever read The Education of Henry Adams. This is the grandson of John Quincy Adams, great-grandson of President John Adams, who was a scholar, who was a historian in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And he wrote this kind of quasi-memoir for his friends. It's very sardonic, and it's a very interesting book. I find it very engaging, but it's very dark. But the form of the book is the world that he was born into and was raised to be an elite in no longer exists. And a lot of that is technological, right? In many parts of the book, he talks about the industrial changes of the late 19th century, in how the world that he was born into transformed in such a fundamental way that he wasn't able to follow in what his grandfather, say, would have expected of the world for him, because that world didn't exist anymore. And so even over the course of his lifetime, the transformations were so enormous. I think about my own grandmother, who is 102 now, and she was born in 1920, and to think about the changes she's experienced in her lifetime, which are obviously enormous. But there's something, to me, very unique in global world history of kind of from the end of the 18th century to the early 20th century that I am not sure is repeatable in terms of its scale and its magnitude. And I think that, again, purely subjectively, makes me think that the work has to be about social organization and human behavior and the moral choices that we make, and not waiting for the technology that's going to make our problems go away.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much. I am going to give this back to Margaret. Margaret, are you there? I think you might still be muted.
I think I just unmuted, did I?
You did. Yeah, we can hear you.
Well, thank you, Peter. I'm going to ask Anne at this point to draw a name for the book giveaway. And I just thank you again, Peter, for being with us, and thank you to all of our participants. So if you all will just please stay with us for a few more minutes while we announce the winner of the book drawing. And if you are the winner, please use the chat to tell Ann Caruso your mailing address so we can get the book to you. So look for the name Ann Caruso in the chat. Give her your name and well, she knows your name, but your address so she can get that book to you. So Ann, do we get a drum roll? Who's the winner?
So just so people know, we do a random drawing in a little box with numbers in it, and the participants are in a line, and I, give them numbers, and I draw one of the numbers, and the people that are in the committee that put together this program, of course, are not eligible to win. So I know last time somebody in the chat had asked about that process. So the winner is Jean, and I think it's pronounced Hazley, Haseley. So congratulations, Jean. And please put your snail mail address in the chat, and we will order the book and have it sent to you. And thanks everybody for joining us tonight. And thank you, Peter, for a wonderful talk.
Thank you all. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks, Anne. And we invite you all as our final program announcement for tonight. We invite you all to join us for our next Distinguished Speakers event, which is Eric Rutkow, who will be with us on September 16th, 4 p.m. That's a Saturday. And the American Canopy Trees, Forests, and the Making of a Nation will be his topic on that day. So please plan to join us. Watch for the information in your emails. And then there is the entire offering of speakers. I think Linda will put that up shortly here. You see Eric coming up, and Doug Ptolemy and Dennis Drabell will be our speakers for the next through the end of this year. And thank you, Ted. I don't know as Ted is on yet, but thanks to Ted for all the work he's done in lining up our speakers for our speakers series. We hope you can join us for each of these events for September, November, and December. And finally, once again, please consider making a donation to FACT if you can. We appreciate your support for all of the reasons that we mentioned earlier for the Distinguished Speaker Series and to continue the work of FACT. And if you are interested in that, go to factohio.org so that you can see all the work that this organization does. Thank you all again. Saying good night. Peter, any final words for us?
It was just a pleasure to be with you tonight. Thank you again.
Thank you. We'll see you all Saturday, September 16th at 4 for our next program. Mark your calendars, and you can go to our website to register to see all of our work. Anne and Linda, thank you. You are technological geniuses. All I can do is read a script. So we've been a team tonight. Thank you. Thank you all. Good night, everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.